The Evening Star, on Saturday, July 31st, 1937, reported that the Senate Commerce Committee had approved a new bill called the Safety at Sea Bill. Quote, "The passenger list bill, introduced yesterday by Senator Copeland, Democrat of New York, as a result of the burning of the city of Baltimore the night before, would require owners of vessels carrying passengers for fire on inland or coastal waters overnight to deposit ashore complete lists of passengers carried."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Flames of the City of Baltimore?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The City of Baltimore had been built in 1911 for the Chesapeake Steamship Company, along with her sister ship, the City of Norfolk. As their names suggested, the ships were intended to ferry people between Baltimore and Norfolk. The City of Baltimore was a 2,379-ton, 3-deck steamship, with a crew of 53 and 2 officers under the command of Captain Charles Brooks. Captain Brooks had been serving with the Chesapeake Steamship Company for 30 years by 1937. Captain Brooks had earned his master's certificate 35 years before, and had been in command of the City of Baltimore for 19. He could be considered to have the full trust of the company and the passengers that he would safely deliver the ship under his command to her destination. On the 29th of July, 1937, the City of Baltimore departed at 6:30 p.m. on her regular overnight run from Baltimore to Norfolk. On board, she carried 72 passengers in addition to her regular crew of 56. It being a Thursday night, many of the passengers were looking forward to a weekend excursion in Norfolk before returning to Baltimore. About an hour and a half later, they were 15 miles south of Baltimore, with the passengers comfortably settled in to dinner, when a sailor called out to watchman Frank Barnes that there was a fire. Barnes had been on his patrol around the ship and had just inspected the cargo amidship, and was walking forward along the freight deck when the sailor called out to him. Barnes turned to see that there was fire licking along the edge of the sugar bag bottoms. Barnes acted quickly and stomped it out, with the assistance of one of the sailors. They thought the danger had passed. 2 minutes later, halfway between the front and midship gangways, only feet from where Barnes was standing, fire erupted from the top of the cargo of sugar. Barnes would later testify that it was like someone had thrown gasoline on it. The sugar fire was the second fire that the City of Baltimore had experienced in the space of a couple of months. The first fire occurred while the City of Baltimore was docked in Norfolk on June 24th of the same year. In that case, the fire had a clear origin point of the galley, and Norfolk firemen had been able to extinguish it quickly before it could do much damage. On that occasion, the blaze had been put out quickly enough, and the damage was small enough that the City of Baltimore was able to depart for the city of her namesake without delay that evening, sporting only some damaged woodwork. The fire in the sugar was of much less certain origin, and would have a far greater impact on the lives of those on board. Barnes, on seeing that the second fire in the sugar was much larger and more serious, called to the pilot house to alert the officers of what was happening before grabbing a nearby fire hose. To his dismay, the fire hose failed to produce any water, and the first water that was introduced to fight against the blaze was when Second Officer Horsley arrived and turned on the sprinkler system. In the meantime, Barnes went and got a second fire hose, but it would not be long before he would be driven back by the flames and smoke which were gaining in spite of his efforts. Second Officer Horsley, meanwhile, turned his attention to trying to get the first fire hose to work, but no matter what they did, water would not come out of it. Chief Engineer Simmons, for his part, smelled smoke when he came to the deck after dinner, and as he approached the engine room, one of the firemen ran towards him and told him that the ship was on fire. Chief Engineer Simmons shouted to his crew to start the pumps so that the fire equipment would work, only to be told that the pumps were already working. With that done, Chief Engineer Simmons opened some of the sprinkler system valves to aid in the fight against the growing blaze. He would never be able to give an explanation as to why one of the fire hoses did not work, or the fact that the sprinkler system was so ineffective that it was rumored that it had not been installed or was completely inoperable. He did say that Barnes had turned to him after he had turned on the sprinklers and told him, "Chief, that water is going to ruin all that sugar." If Barnes was still worried about the sugar at that point, it showed how little he understood how fast the fire had grown in the short amount of time that had elapsed. Within 5 minutes of the start of the fire, it was bursting over the top deck and starting to engulf the ship. On shore, Mrs. Clecka, wife of a United States Marshal stationed in Bayside, saw the fire spring up and immediately notified the authorities. People staying at a nearby resort who had been sitting outside and enjoying the evening also caught sight of the burning ship and rushed to the beach to see what was happening. All along the beach, people who had fishing boats began to push them out to see if they could assist. Captain Brooks turned his ship towards the shallow water and gave the order for the crew to begin to distribute lifebelts. There was no radio on board of the City of Baltimore, so they were not able to radio for assistance. At this point, there was little doubt that they would have to abandon ship, and it was a matter of making it a situation where people could do so as safely as possible. Captain Brooks told the crew to prepare the lifeboats. While the crew was readying the boats, Captain Brooks tried to sound the ship's whistle to alert anyone who was not already aware that the ship was on fire. The whistle did not function, however. It was later learned that the ship's bartender, Williams, had initially grabbed a fire hose, but then Captain Brooks had ordered him to a lifeboat instead. While rushing towards the boat, Williams had tripped over the whistle cord, which stretched from the pilot house across to the whistle on the ship's stack, and broken it, something no one had noticed in the confusion. As proof of this, Williams was able to show the Board of Inquiry the mark on his leg that had been left by the mishap. Mrs. Clecka would tell the papers that she did not see the ship launch any lifeboats until 15 minutes after she had seen the fire on the ship, which suggests that Captain Brooks had waited for a very long time before he thought to raise the alarm, long after it would have been needed. In the meantime, and in spite of the lack of radio and whistle, the fire had not gone unnoticed by other boats and ships in the area, which turned towards the burning vessel in the hopes of rendering aid. The burning of the City of Baltimore would have been hard to miss. One witness said that at first he had thought an oil tanker was burning, considering how fiercely the fire was burning and how quickly it spread. The first ship to reach the burning City of Baltimore was a freighter belonging to the American Hawaiian line called the Arkansas. The Arkansas was not far behind the City of Baltimore when she burst into flames, and Captain Jones ordered his ship to the side of the burning vessel to render aid. Within 6 minutes, the Arkansas had a boat lowered which was picking up people who had started to leap into the water to escape the flames. This was hampered by the City of Baltimore herself, which was still underway in spite of the fire that was raging on board her. Captain Jones was willing to put his ship in some danger if it meant saving lives, so they had drawn close to the City of Baltimore despite the flames, only to have the City of Baltimore come towards them on a collision course. The first time this occurred, they were able to avoid the other ship, but the second time they were struck amidship on the starboard side. Some of the hull plates of the Arkansas were damaged as a result. After bouncing off of the Arkansas, the City of Baltimore struck a bank but bounced off that, and the captain of the Arkansas was forced to keep his ship at a distance in the face of the City of Baltimore's erratic behavior. He could only assume that there was no longer anyone in the engine room or the wheel. The lifeboat of the Arkansas was able to save 5 people from the water, but the Arkansas would not get so close to the other ship again. Eventually, the City of Baltimore came to rest in the shallows off of Bayside Beach. On board of the City of Baltimore, the crew and passengers alike had been driven to the forward part of the vessel, where people in the surrounding boats were able to see them in clear distress. It was noted that, though they were shouting for help, there did not seem to be any panic, even as people were forced to hang over the side of the ship to save themselves from the fire. The fire was so intense that even though people in small boats were standing by in the hopes of offering assistance, they were not able to get close enough to the ship to do so. The men in the first fishing boat to arrive by the side of the burning vessel said that they had shouted to the people on board to jump and they would save them, but that the people on the ship were too distraught to follow such advice. In the end, they were driven off by the heat and the waves, and they had to give up the rescue attempt. Other boats remained standing by, and when people were given no choice but to jump from the burning ship, they were ready to pull them from the water. One fishing party, which fortunately had happened to include 2 firefighters, pulled 2 men out of the water that the firemen were forced to resuscitate, but they were able to revive them. Thanks to the timely alarm of Mrs. Klecka, the pilot boat, the William D. Sanner, was sent out, and it would do the bulk of the rescue work. In total, the pilot boat would rescue 60 of the people who had leapt from the burning ship. Also joining in the rescue was Captain Shafroth of the nearby Naval Academy training vessel, who arrived in command of 5 rescue boats from the Academy, the Coast Guard cutter Apache, fireboats, and Coast Guard vessels dispatched when Baltimore got the news of the fire, and members of the Red Cross. By the time most of these rescuers arrived, the survivors had already been pulled from the water by the surrounding small boats that had swarmed from the shore. Several of the people who jumped from the City of Baltimore had swam to shore themselves. There was still a need for aid, though. Not everyone who reached the shore was in good condition, and it was hard to know who had been rescued in the chaos. Captain Brooks, who had been the last person to leave the City of Baltimore, had been rescued from where he had been hanging from the side of his burning ship. He was described initially as out of his mind, and he ranted to the rescuers that he thought at least 60 people had been lost. It was enough to make the initial newspaper stories full of dread about the disaster that had occurred. Once Captain Brooks revived, he told the people who asked him that he thought that everyone had escaped from the ship safely, and there were no casualties. He had been wrong both times. When the smoke settled, it was found that 2 passengers had passed away while on their way to the hospital, while 2 other people were missing. This determination took time since the ship's purser had been the only person who had a list of the passengers, and many of the survivors had been rushed to safety with no thought of taking their information. The search vessels went to work looking for the 2 who were missing, while fire crews went to work putting out the fire on the ship, which could be seen for miles along the beach. It was eventually discovered that the missing passenger had simply gone back to New York without thinking of saying anything to anyone. The other missing man, one of the ship's oilers, was, however, lost. 9 others had been burned by the fires, 6 of which had to seek medical attention. The inquiries into what happened came quickly. The crew could not agree about whether or not the ship's hoses had produced water, if everything had been in working order, or if the sprinklers on the forward part of the vessel had been operational. This matter was settled when it was found that while they had told the chief engineer correctly that the pumps were on, not all of the available pumps had been put into use. Second Engineer Neal was found guilty of negligence for not directing all water possible towards the flames. Captain Brooks, throughout the inquiry, insisted that he thought that the ship had been the victim of sabotage, though he could not say why it would have been. His theory was fueled when the captain of the pilot boat brought him a kerosene can that had washed up on the beach. Captain Brooks told the inquiry that the City of Baltimore used mineral oil, not kerosene. There would have been no reason for kerosene to be on his ship. It was not an argument that would get him any mercy from the court. Captain Brooks' license was suspended for failing to sound a general alarm and for not getting the passengers into lifeboats promptly when the fire got out of control. The fire on the City of Baltimore was an incident that many recognized could have been significantly worse if they had not been very lucky in circumstances. Lawmakers were quickly discussing the passing of laws that would make it so that even coastal passenger vessels would need to carry radio to call for help. The idea that the purser had been the only person who could say who was on the ship was also a cause for concern. If he had not been able to produce the list, families could have been left completely unsure about whether or not they had lost a loved one. There was a call for reform to take place on the entire industry. The City of Baltimore also had a little more fire left in her. Her smoldering wreckage was left on the beach with a watchman on it when on August 7th her name was mentioned alongside another fire. The Augusta C. Quinn, loaded with a cargo of watermelon, caught fire for no apparent reason only a couple hundred yards from where the City of Baltimore was still resting. Many of the small boats that had participated in the rescue work of the City of Baltimore only 9 days before once more set out from shore to save the crew of 3. Almost as though it was responding to the nearby ship fire, the smoldering wreckage once again lit up, with a new fire taking hold in less burnt forward part of the ship. It was the final flame of the City of Baltimore. For more information, please see the Helena Independent from July 30th, 1937, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.